So in the last video, we talked about different organizations of organisms and how they affect the environment. In this video, we're going to talk about energy flow within an ecosystem or energy flow throughout an environment. So energy flow in an ecosystem. Sunlight is the main energy source for life on Earth. So 99.9% of organisms get their energy from the sunlight. And as you know, we cannot convert sunlight into energy. We need producers for that. So other organisms, like 0.1%, actually use chemosynthesis, which is, as we've talked about before, in the deep oceans, they utilize gases from hydrothermal vents. But what we're going to talk about when we talk about energy flow in this video is organisms that base their energy from sunlight. So less than 1% of sunlight is actually used by organisms on Earth. Energy flows through ecosystems from producers to consumers. So what is a producer? So producer is going to make its own food. So we have different types of producers. We have plants that make their own food, algae, certain types of fungi can make their own food, certain bacteria can make their own food. So these are all producers. And how do they make that food? We'll talk more about that as we go through this video. And then a consumer is something that can't make its food. So we're consumers. We cannot make our own energy. We have to eat energy from plants or animals that eat plants. So consumers do not make their own energy. They get food by eating producers or other consumers that eat producers. So producers can also be called autotrophs, and we learned in class auto means self, and then trophs mean nourishment. So they're self-feeders or self-nourishers. So producers often contain chlorophyll, so they can use energy directly from the sun. So they photosynthesize. So we'll talk more about the cycles of photosynthesis later in the next video. But as I said, plants, algae, some protists and bacteria can photosynthesize, and they are considered producers. So just a little bit of review. We talked about a niche or a niche, which is a role or job of an organism within the environment. And the niche of a producer is to capture and transfer energy into usable form. So they're not actually capturing energy so that for our benefit, so we can use the energy. They're capturing energy from the sun and transforming it into usable energy for their selves. So for their actual energy source that they can use to stay alive. So producers capture and transform energy into organic stored energy for the use of living organisms. They may be photoautotrophs, which remember we talked about photo meaning light. So light self-nourishers. So they use light energy to get energy from the sun. They can also be chemoautotrophs, and they can use other, chemo means chemical. They use other chemical energy and convert that into energy. Most autotrophs are going to be photoautotrophs, though. So photoautotroph is a producer that captures energy from the sun through photosynthesis. So it's going to add oxygen to the atmosphere, but it's going to remove carbon dioxide. So oxygen is actually a byproduct of photosynthesis. Carbon dioxide is needed in order to go through the cycle of photosynthesis. So algae, plants, some bacteria, these are going to photosynthesize. Chemoautotrophs, as we talked about before, they're going to capture energy from inorganic molecules, usually hydrogen sulfide. So chemosynthesis, using chemicals to synthesize to make energy. So these are the closest we have to aliens on Earth, but these often occur in these sea vents, and you can see the gases coming through the sea vents, and this is gases from volcanic activity within the Earth. And they're going to take this hydrogen sulfide and transfer it into usable energy. And they can sustain a whole ecosystem here through that, just like we can sustain ecosystems on land through photosynthesis. So here's another picture of these are tube worms that are living in these on these hydrothermal vents and sustaining life through that. Okay, so now we have consumers. So consumers are called heterotrophs. Hetero means different, and then trophs obviously mean nourishment, so different nourishment. So they can't make their food. They have to eat other organisms to obtain their energy. So this is where the food chain or the food web comes in, and we'll talk more about that as we go through this video. So we have different types of consumers. Herbivores eat only plants. Carnivores eat only animals. And omnivores eat both. So we are omnivores. Usually as you increase through the food pyramid, the energy pyramid or the food chain, you're going to get carnivores. Omnivores are kind of in the middle of that food chain. We're kind of an exception to that rule. But herbivores are going to be at the bottom of the food chain, right above producers. We also have detritivores, which eat dead organic matter. These are generally really important for the soil. So you have some earthworms that are detrivores, and they go down and they break apart organic materials into the soil and break them back into the nutrients needed to complete the cycle. And then we have decomposers that break down organic matter into simpler compounds. So these are going to break down dead matter and put those nutrients back into the soil as well. So these are kind of like that important link to our food chain or to our nutrient cycle. Okay, so let's do some vocab here. So consumers that eat producers to get energy are primary consumers, and this will be more easily understood when we go to a pyramid form, but they're herbivores. So herbivores are going to eat producers, and they are going to be called primary consumers. Most of the energy will be used up by the consumer. A consumer that eats another consumer is called a secondary consumer. They may be called predators or scavengers, but they are going to be carnivores or omnivores. A consumer that eats another consumer that already ate a consumer is going to be a tertiary consumer. So it's important to note that you can be a tertiary consumer and also a secondary consumer depending on what you're eating within that food web. So it's not as clear-cut as it sounds, but it helps us get some terminology around the pyramid here. So you can see producers are on the bottom. That has the most energy in the pyramid. Primary consumers then eat the producers. Secondary consumers eat those primary consumers. Tertiary consumers are generally at the tops, or they're generally the apex predators of an ecosystem. So feeding relationships. So energy flows through an ecosystem in one direction. So it's going to flow from the producer to the consumers. So the arrows in our feeding relationships are pointing to where the energy is going. So the energy is going from the plant to the frog, from the frog to the snake, from the snake to the owl. So the arrows always point to where the energy is going. Transfer of energy from the sun to producer to primary consumer, then to higher order consumers is called a food chain. It's important to note that there's not a lot of food chains in a natural environment. Most of them are actually food webs, so they're interlocking food chains because most organisms do not just eat one other organism. So food chain is a linear sequence, which we just talked about. When we're talking about levels of a food chain, we're going to talk about trophic levels. So trophic levels just label the level of nourishment in a food chain. So carnivores are going to be at the highest trophic level. Producers are going to be at the lowest trophic level. Energy flows up the food chain from the lowest trophic level to the highest trophic level. So food webs are a more natural depiction of how organisms interact within an environment. food webs link all these different food chains together. So we have like a heron would eat a ribbed mussel, but it also eats plankton eating fish. So most organisms have multiple other organisms that they eat. They don't just eat one organism. That's not always true, but mostly true. And so we have these more interactive food webs where we put different food chains together. And these food webs model a complex network of feeding relationships and the flow of energy within ecosystems. So we did some food webs in class, but here is a depiction of a food web. And so it always seems to lead up to kind of like the apex predator at the top of the food chain, but it always starts with producers at the bottom. And then we have our primary consumers, our secondary consumers, our tertiary consumers here. Okay, so that is all I have about energy within an ecosystem. So again, you can go back in any time you would like and review this video. Thanks for watching.